Whenever you're
Oops.
ready.
Happy Friday, everybody, and welcome back. You know that today is the 10th consecutive week that we've been together for these Fireside Fire Drills. And I'll tell you what, they're what's keeping me sane right now. Before we get into today's program, I want to take a moment to acknowledge George Floyd, who was murdered by police last week in Minneapolis. I'm sure you've been reading about it. The environmental community must stand in solidarity with the Black community and the movement for Black lives. You know, fighting for a green and peaceful future includes speaking out against the unjust, racist, and systemic violence facing Black people in this country, especially when it's at the hands of the police. Silence is not an option. Protest is a strategy to demand justice. We have to understand that, to demand rights and equal treatment. And protest is often the only way for people on the margins to demand change and accountability. It's unconscionable not to be outraged by Black people being killed by police on a shockingly regular basis. We stand in solidarity with those demanding justice and action in Minneapolis and around the country. We also demand justice for essential workers who've lost their lives in this pandemic. It's shocking and unforgivable that it's hard for me to get his name out of my mouth, Mitch McConnell, and the Senate are dragging their feet on the bill that would give urgent relief to essential workers who are every single day risking their lives to keep the rest of us safe. Just this week, new polling was released conducted by Change Research on behalf of Care in Action. And it shows that widespread support from voters exists for the HEROES Act across 8 swing states. Democrats and independents in all 8 states reported being more likely to vote for someone who supports the HEROES Act. Protecting people who protect us should not be a partisan issue, just as climate action should not be a partisan issue. I know I've been asking you to call Congress and the Senate a lot lately, and here's why. This is a major moment in the history of this planet. And the decisions that the Senate makes in the coming weeks and months will set us on a path in one direction or another direction. One direction props up a broken system that has created massive injustice for decades and that allows the most corrupt and polluting companies a seat at the political decision-making table, that denies millions of Americans health care in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, come on. We have to fight with everything we've got not to go down that path, especially since there's an alternative path that would address so many of these structural problems. We could invest in our communities, and we could take this once in a lifetime opportunity to invest in green renewable energy that could transform our economy and create millions of good jobs at a time when we so desperately need them. All of that instead of bailing out the fossil fuel companies and corporate CEOs. We have to invest in our humanity. So please, once again, I'm going to ask you to pick up your phones and be heard. I mean, they can't ignore all of us, and there are a lot of us. So please, let's keep up the pressure. We've created a simple way for you to call the Senate, which you can find at firedrillfridays.com/workers. And there you'll find talking points to guide you through your call, just like Lily did when she was with us a few Fridays ago. So please go to that page so you can make the call later after today's Fireside Fire Drill. And of course, if you haven't already, please text Jane to 877-877. That's how you can join the Fire Drill Friday community and stay connected to these important opportunities that we can take action together. We really need you to be part of this. Okay, I said last Friday that we're going to start a new thing. Every Friday, we're going to announce good news, good climate news. And there are two really promising developments this week, which is good news right there. Huge victory in Santa Barbara as the second of three companies that's working to expand dangerous oil drilling in Cat Canyon has just withdrawn its request. The company is called ERA, and it's co-owned by Shell and Exxon. And they've been advancing this dangerous drilling project for years, despite the well-documented impacts on water, air, endangered species, and climate, as well as overwhelming opposition by the community. Let's send huge thanks and congratulations to the Environmental Defense Center, hi Rocky, Santa Barbara County Action Now, Food and Water Watch, Center for Biological Diversity, Sierra Club Los Padres chapter, and so many others. Thank you to their leadership for this critical new infrastructure fight. This is just great. And the second piece of good news for you, the oil and gas industry lost appeals in two major climate damages cases this week. There's a slew of Californian cities and counties who are pursuing court battles against oil companies like ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, for industry compensation for climate change impacts, such as sea level rise, for example. So this court ruling against the oil companies paves the way for these cases to go ahead. Yay. And we couldn't be happier about this. You know, Exxon and those other fossil fools want us, the people, us, to foot the bill for these climate disasters that they created. There's no way we're going to let that happen without a fight, right? It's only fair that cities and counties demand oil corporations pay for the damages they created. They should also be made to pay the medical bills for the people who are sick and dying from their pollution. You know, like probably millions of Americans, when I used to think of the climate crisis, I thought about oceans and forests, melting ice sheets, species going extinct. But during the Fire Drill Fridays, I've learned that millions of low-income communities, communities of color, and indigenous communities experience the climate crisis very differently. They live at the source of the problem, where wells and chemicals bore down into 400-million-year-old fossils, shattering an entire underground ecosystem and bringing that which was never meant to be exposed to the surface, into the air and water and the lungs and the hearts of people living there. These same communities are also at the end point of this poisonous circus, where the liquefied fossils are burned and spilled and leaked and refined into plastic and exported, sending again scores of lethal chemicals into the air and water. I learned from my Fire Drill Fridays about a 1987 report called Toxic Wastes and Race in the United States. What this report revealed is that companies deliberately look for communities of color, low-income and indigenous and rural communities when deciding where to place their hazardous facilities. It's deliberate. And as a result, these communities are disproportionately polluted, disproportionately subject to a range of really serious health impacts, disproportionately vulnerable to viruses like COVID-19, and even worse, they're excluded from any decision-making about these facilities that are impacting their lives. I've been in these communities. Our second Fire Drill Friday in California took place in one of them. People are suffering, people are dying all over the country. Do you know what the oil companies call these communities? Sacrifice zones. Los Angeles is surrounded by them, so is Kern County and the bayous of Louisiana, rural communities of Alabama, swaths of the Navajo Nation and Houston and low-income areas of Philadelphia. I mean, that's just to name a few. These are places where many of our essential workers live because rents are cheaper. Our nurses, our teachers, our home caregivers and delivery persons and tip workers, their children look out of their school windows onto oil rigs. These kids, when they play sports, they have to constantly stop and use inhalers or inhalators or whatever they call it, those things for asthma, because methane flares from the refineries right there cast shadows on the playing fields. Well, they may be the first to feel the impacts of the chemicals they breathe and drink, but these are the very same chemicals that are altering the climate and the environment for everyone else, including those who think their wealth will save them. This is why, to fight climate change, we have to address the idea of environmental justice for all. While Trump and armies of corporate lobbyists pressure politicians to give billion-dollar corporations billions more in tax breaks and stimulus packages, people in these so-called sacrifice zones can't pay rent or water bills and lack health insurance to cover their asthma and heart diseases and cancer. Do you know what will change this? Democracy. That's right. What we grew up thinking we had, all the while it was being taken away in the name of freedom from big government. Well, we're going to get it back, our democracy, and it's going to take a fight, and the fight is on. And you're part of it, right? And right now, it's about getting all that stimulus money where it needs to go, to frontline workers, to make our healthcare system healthy and democratic, to small businesses, and into the clean, sustainable energy sector. Both because this is an important step in weaning off fossil fuels and slowing the climate crisis, but also because that's where most of the jobs are. Study after study has shown that investment in clean energy produces many more jobs than investment in fossil fuels. A recent global survey of more than 200 of the world's most senior economists at the onset of the COVID-19 economic turndown confirmed these findings, concluding that clean energy infrastructure is the top investment we can make, both in terms of climate benefits and having the highest stimulus effect. They say clean energy infrastructure is politically well-suited, particularly well-suited, as an economic recovery measure because it's very labor intensive. Now, the framework to accomplish all this exists. It's called a Green New Deal. And the Trump administration is doing everything it can to demonize a Green New Deal, make people think it's too expensive, too socialistic, which is pretty funny given that socialism in this country does exist. It's called corporate socialism. $60 billion to the fossil fuel industry, billions to industrialized farming, socialism. Well, I am beyond excited that my guest today is just the person we need to hear from, who can speak authoritatively and interestingly on all of these issues. I'm talking about Heather McGhee, a political commentator, policy analyst, and currently a distinguished senior fellow and former president of Demos, a nonprofit progressive think tank. You may well have seen Heather in All In with Chris Hayes, Meet the Press, or Real Time with Bill Maher. It gives me enormous pleasure to welcome Heather McGhee. Welcome, Heather. Thanks for being here.
Jane, it is such an honor. You are so good. You are just so good at describing the stakes in ways that connect on a very human level. We just so need your voice. Thank you.
Well, we need yours. Thank you, Heather. I have to, first of all, ask you about Minneapolis. Like many people, I watched the news in the last several nights. What can we do to end racism in this country? What can we do to make things better?
Thank you, Jane. So first of all, I want to start by just centering us in the grief and the rage that I think we are all to some degree holding for the loss of the life, for the murder of George Floyd, for Breonna Taylor, for Ahmaud Arbery. It feels like it's been a number of weeks where there has just been a season and an open season on Black lives. And the reason why it's so emotional is that it's coming at a time where every day Black people, many of them are elders, are being killed by a virus that itself is not targeting Black people, but we know that racism and the racist structures that leave Black people exposed disproportionately, including pollution and environmental racism, is targeting Black people. And so this is just a moment when, for all of you who are listening, who are Black or who have Black people that you love, it's just a time of a lot of community level grief right now and anger. Just really moments before our conversation began, we got news that the police officer who killed George Floyd was taken into custody. I'm seeing that there were charges, I think maybe third-degree murder, which is wholly insufficient, but also, it's progress from where we were a day ago and 2 days ago. And I will say it is progress from where we were 2 years ago, from where we were 3 years ago or 4 years ago, where it really felt like there was no accountability, where people who have the badge or who act as if they have the badge kill Black people and are never taken into custody, never lose their jobs, never become at all accountable for the loss of life. So we are making progress on police accountability, and there's more that you can do. You who are listening, I'm a proud co-chair of the board of an organization called Color of Change, which is the largest online racial justice organization. We have over 4 million members. You can join, become a member, colorchange.org. And specifically, we have just relaunched the only nationwide database of prosecutors. So you can go online and look and see who your prosecutor is. Because for every videotape of a man or woman or child being killed by the police, there are some that are not recorded. And those decisions are being made to prosecute or not prosecute, to set a climate where Black Lives Matter or they don't, at the level of the prosecutor, and those are elected positions. So Color of Change can give folks a way to make sure that their prosecutor is one that values Black lives and that is responsive to the community, and Color of Change has a political arm that can help you get involved in making sure that bad prosecutors get kicked out and good prosecutors elected. We also obviously have to make sure that accountability starts at the top. Donald Trump has recognized since the beginning of his political life that this kind of racial division is a political winner for him. It's disgusting to say, but it's true. And I hope we talk more about sort of why that is. What's the formula that makes it possible that fanning the flames of racial hatred and division could actually be good politically for someone? But you can see he's doing it right now on Twitter. And I want to applaud the folks at Twitter for starting to fact check him and give warnings about what it is that he's saying online. Mm-hmm. And then finally, I think it's really important and incumbent upon everyone that we, and I know we're going to talk about this, Jane, that we make sure that we recognize that it's everyone's responsibility to address racism. It is not just about people of color. It's not even just about criminal justice and police. This country was founded, as my mother always says, on a belief in a hierarchy of human value. That was our founding. That was the original design of the economic system that created untold excesses of wealth at the cost, the extraction from our earth, the decimation of Native peoples, and the stolen labor and bodies of Black people. And we have not really uprooted that belief. And so, of course, you see that in all of our systems, our tax system, our banks and lending systems, our housing systems, our systems of criminal justice, our systems of education, those roots are still giving fruit. It's very possible to have an agenda that fundamentally puts all of our communities on equal footing. Of course, policy got us into this mess. It can get us out of it. But we need everyone to see race and see racism for where it is, and to commit themselves to educating themselves, to voting, to organizing, to being unafraid to be race conscious in the work that you do, and to advocate for color conscious policies, because we are not a colorblind society. And I think that's incumbent upon everyone, and we can weave it into our activism, including our activism around climate and the environment.
Yeah, thanks for that, Heather. You know, I for several weeks I've been just appalled as I look at this administration's approach to solving the COVID crisis, and how meatpacking plants, poultry plants all over the country, jails, are simply not getting what they need, to an extent that is just, it's horrific. But then I realized they're Black people and they're brown people and they're immigrants working in these plants. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's like the Trump administration is just saying, well, let's just write them off. Let them die. Nobody's going to be upset. And mainstream media isn't talking about it. Mm-hmm. It's like racism permeates the entire administration's approach to COVID, and not enough people are talking about this. Am I right?
You're absolutely right, Jane. You know, this is an administration that has a racist agenda, has a white supremacist agenda, that has white supremacists in office, not just Donald Trump, but, you know, Stephen Miller and lots of people whose names are not household names, who are using every single policy decision as a way to further do what white supremacy does, which is concentrate wealth in the hands of a few on the backs of people of color. And so when you look at, I'm so glad you brought up the topic of the meatpacking plants. When you look at what has been the Republican agenda there, it has been, one, make sure that these factories and plants are still open, but require no protections for essential workers. Use this as an even further excuse to rig the rules more in the favor of the employers. Mitch McConnell, who, as you said, and I really want to thank you for your advocacy for essential workers, Mitch McConnell has refused to take up this subsequent bill that is so necessary. It is languishing after having passed the House. We have, and what he has been trying to do, instead of get the American people the help that we need because of the crisis, is make sure that there is no liability for companies that pack their people in without proper protective equipment and then get sick. So we have meat processing plants all over the country that have 50% of their workers being sick with COVID-19. These are workers who are people who have no health insurance. They have no health insurance because those companies do not deign to give them health insurance. They're being paid minimum wage. Many of them do not have documentation. And so they really have zero recourse. And what we need to do is obviously pass the Essential Workers Bill of Rights, but we also need to recognize that part of the reason why people think that they can get away with it is because they are counting on white Americans who are still overrepresented in the halls of power, whether it's the boardroom or the state houses in and Washington, to not care, to turn a blind eye. You know, you saw actually in I can't remember which state it was a state that has a large meat processing industry, and they were debating about whether or not to open up again. And one of the state legislators said, well, oh, I'm sorry, it was a judge in litigation, said, well, oh yes, but the hotspot is in the meat processing plant, not where regular people are.
Yeah. Ohio, I think that was.
It was Ohio, that's right. So they're counting on that attitude. And they're not counting on what we've seen actually all across the country, which is a tremendous amount of solidarity and goodwill from good people to do what they can. In fact, I think there's a lot more that people want to do.
Yeah.
A lot of people who have had the luxury of being able to shelter in place and be at home, we're sewing masks, we're donating to food banks, so people want to do more. And so I hope that where we're going to see that this surge of sense of solidarity and interconnectedness is in the ballot booth, or the mail-in ballot rather, which we may have to do by November. But I do think that politics have shifted fundamentally, and that with good organizing, we are going to be able to see a system change.
Yeah. From your mouth to the goddess's ear.
That's right.
I've heard you say that it's not just race that is a multiplier of inequalities. It's that racism is the driver of inequalities for everyone. Can you explain this?
Sure. I've have spent almost 20 years in public policy, specifically economic policy. That has been my background in my career. And my goal has really always been to try to rewrite the rules so that everyone has an equal chance in America. And I've known, obviously, as a Black woman born and raised on the South Side of Chicago, but also, as a person who does economic policy, that there are these disparities, right? That it is harder to get ahead and to get by if you're a woman, if you're a person of color, if you're an immigrant. And I've known what the policy decisions have been that have made that the case. And so that's generally speaking how we think about race in the economy. We think there's the economy, it's unequal, and it's more unequal for people of color. It's more unequal for women and immigrants and Native people. But what I have discovered over the past 10 years, and I have spent the last 2 years on a journey across the country working on a book that will be out early next year called The Sum of Us, is that it's not just that racism accelerates inequality, it's that racism is a driver of inequality. And here's what I mean. Our country was actually quite generous when we were 90% white. You often hear progressives talk about the golden era of shared prosperity between the New Deal and the 1970s. You even hear Donald Trump talking about make America great again. And he's not just talking about make it white again, he's also talking about a moment in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s when a white man could have a middle-class life with just a diploma, high school diploma, and a union card, right? There was a moment when there was a great expansion of the middle class and the quality of life was very high. We invested in the public school system. We invested in the land-grant colleges, the flagship universities. We created the highway system. We put up dams and roads and bridges. We solved problems. We put a man on the moon. I mean, what do you want, right? America could do it. Mm-hmm. And all of that was contingent upon a social contract that put white men at the center. And what I have discovered is that what happened to that social contract in the 1960s and 70s, when women and people of color and immigrants and LGBT people said, you know what, we want a seat at that table too, that social contract was torn apart. And the white men basically got up and left the bargaining table. And so what has that meant? That was when you started to see in the mid-1970s a whole raft of changes in our public policies and in our business practices. You started to see corporations organize to depress the wage floor. You no longer had the biggest employer being GM saying, we want to pay people, enough money so that they could buy our cars. Then you started to have businesses say, we want to crush unions. The biggest employer was Walmart saying we want to pay bargain basement wages. And you started to see government pull back. In my book, The Sum of Us, which is available for pre-order now, and in the TED Talk that I did right before the pandemic hit, that is available online, I talk about this central story, I think, which tells so much about the state of affairs right now in America, which is when across the country, not just in the American South, when towns that had these big resort swimming pools that were sort of the center of the town where everyone gathered in the hot summer sun, and it was a place where, working class kids and middle class kids and families could all meet together and spend all weekends and evenings. It was a real heartbeat of many towns and cities. And most of those places were segregated. And even though it was tax dollars from everyone, those public pools that were maintained in a public way and built in a public way were for whites only. And when in the 1950s and 1960s, the desegregation orders came down, so many towns and cities decided to drain their public swimming pools rather than let Black families and children swim too. Mm-hmm. And it feels like that's where we are now as a country, where we haven't yet regained the will for a multiracial America to really invest in ourselves and treat our workers well, to plan for the future, to have a functioning democracy. It feels like the wheels are off. And part of that is because there's a sense from the white power structure that is very narrow and getting narrower and narrower by the day in terms of the people who are really still benefiting from this corrupt economic system that we have. There's a sense from the white power structure of, we're just going to loot this while we can. We have no sense of social solidarity with who is today's working and middle class, because they are those other people that we can pack in meat packing plants and look the other way. And that's where we are. That doesn't have to be where we are at all, because so many people are suffering before the pandemic, that there are green shoots of social solidarity, and it is still a very, very narrow minority that is in control and setting these rules that are really unpopular, frankly. Keeping taxes low, not investing in our schools and in our people and in our future, having the minimum wage be low, not doing anything about childcare, keeping healthcare something that you have to struggle to get. Those aren't popular positions, but it is where the power structure is. And I think a lot of that has to do with an unwillingness to share the fruits of America's greatness with a multiracial America.
And when that happens, when the laws and the policies that maintain racism, like redlining and the difficulty for people of color to accumulate wealth and buy homes and all the other things that maintain racism, if those were eliminated, the structural aspects of it, do you think that white Americans would change? Do you think that the racism would be diminished? I just love the story of the man that called you up and said, "I'm a racist. How can I change?" It's not exactly what he said, but it gives me great hope. And if the structures are taken away, can people behave like him and change, do you think?
I think we have to do both. Because there was a massive amount of structural barriers that were lifted with the Civil Rights Act, with the Voting Rights Act, with the new enforcements of the equal protection laws, with Title X, right? All of these things that were the victories of people like you, Jane, and the movements that you were a part of in the 1960s and early 70s. And I mean, it's a scale of legal and policy change that I have not seen in my lifetime in a positive direction. And so many things happened, therefore, in the consciousness of men around women's rights, and in the consciousness of white people around rights around people of color. It was a watershed. However, we have to be constantly vigilant. Mm-hmm. Because what happened was, and I've done in the research for my book some in-depth looking at the data on this, is that the idea that kids of color should go to school with white kids, it used to be controversial. Now they don't even ask the question anymore, because it's 99% of white people say, of course, that's a great idea. But we're still as segregated as we were before Brown, because that's a great idea, but maybe not my kid, right? What we have is we quickly replaced the civil rights era sort of momentum and consciousness raising with colorblindness, which is an ideology that says, because we want to get to a place where color doesn't matter, let us now operate today as if color doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. And so it was a beautiful, for the right wing, it was sort of a beautiful strategic marriage of sort of the ends and the means. But what that meant was, and this was sort of the racial ideology that I grew up with, and it's something that I think even with the election of President Barack Obama, people felt like, yes, we really have made it. We are a colorblind society. And of course, thankfully, we are in a different phase now where people really are very attuned to the fact that racism still exists. But what colorblindness did was it said, okay, let's stop. Let us stop this color conscious policymaking, right? The Supreme Court didn't really start enforcing Brown until almost 10 years later, and then it stopped that 10 years after that. So there was really a very narrow window. People don't really know this. There was a very narrow window in which we were really moving with all of the sort of resources of the federal government in the direction of equality. And then what happened was we had that sort of organizing, which I started to talk about, the idea that the sort of the business sector and the white male power structure sort of walked away and started plotting to reshape the economy in ways that redistributed wealth upwards. And so those jobs that made for good, decent middle-class life, those were shipped overseas, right? When they would have been opened up to the rest of us, right? And so that has meant that there has been a rise of economic inequality and a sort of removal of our foot from the gas towards racial equality. Mm-hmm. So those two things have meant that both the structures, as you say, Jane, we've slowed down on progress on the structures, and our public discourse has been impoverished. Do I think that people can change? I wouldn't be in this business, this nonprofit business, if I didn't think that people could change, if I hadn't experienced people changing. But I think it's going to take work. I mean, as I said, we put a man on the moon, we invented the solar panel and the light bulb. We can do anything, but I think it's going to take a concerted effort. And on Monday, Barbara Lee, the Representative Barbara Lee, is going to introduce a resolution calling for a national Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission in the United States, which is exactly the level of effort that we need. We've never had one in this country that taught the apartheid state how to do it, right? That taught the Nazi state how to segregate and how to discriminate. We have never had anything like a truth and racial reconciliation effort. I'm very proud to say it's my mother, Dr. Gail Christopher, who architected that vision, and it's happening in 14 states and in over 20 college campuses today. And on Monday, they're going to introduce a resolution to do it nationwide. I give that as a concrete example of the kind of thing that we need to marshal, and I think we're going to need it more now than ever, hopefully after the Trump administration, to heal this country. It's going to take a big national effort, and people can't do it alone. It's not an individual, it's not something we can do at the individual level and have lasting change.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I'm going to segue into the climate crisis, which is not unrelated on many levels. I know that you're aware of the Green New Deal, which relates both to the COVID pandemic and the climate crisis. In fact, there's a lot of overlap in it and includes so many of the solutions needed to address both of the converging crises, the climate crisis and the economy. What needs to happen to get the Green New Deal passed?
Yeah, so great question. So, I mean, I'm assuming for this audience, we don't need to sum up what the Green New Deal does, what the framework is. But here's why it's so important now more than ever, and why it actually, I think, is really the only way forward to heal our economy. I actually don't think that most people are prepared for the level of depression that we are going to be in. People are not using that word. That is absolutely where we are going to be in, probably 2 quarters, two cycles. And it's going to happen particularly because the quiet, disrespected engine of our economy, which has been the labor of people in the service sector, women, people of color, immigrants, childcare, delivery, healthcare, low wage, retail, that has been sucked out of the economy, right? Those jobs, 40% of people making $40,000 or less have lost their jobs, and economists are anticipating that half of those jobs are just not coming back. You can't have a functioning economy without that base. And then what's happening is that the public sector has just been decimated by huge outlays to deal with the crisis, as well as a slashing of the tourism, the sales tax, the property taxes. And so you're seeing 20, 30% losses for cities and states and counties. That's not sustainable. Now, first, we need more revenue, and wealthy people and corporations got a massive tax cut, a few years ago that they obviously didn't save because they needed a whole nother one as soon as the pandemic, another bailout as soon as the pandemic began. So I do think we need to raise taxes at the top, and I do think we need to borrow right now, which we can do in order to fund the recovery. But I also think we need to use that money and invest it wisely. And investing it wisely means investing in our people and the planet. We have actually, Mother Nature and the virus have taken our economy off the tracks. We've just taken it off the tracks. So let's rewire it before we push it to get started again. This is the only time we could really conceive of a whole new centrally designed effort to prioritize where we invest, what the industries are, how it is that we, I've been thinking a lot about the New York tri-state region, which has been the hardest hit by COVID. We could have this be a decade of energy efficiency and solar panels and the jobs that come from that. We're going to have to do Medicare for all and get tens of millions of people more onto public health insurance because, we can't be asking small business and medium-sized businesses to pay, to hire more people when they have to pay 20, 30% more of that on top to pay for private health insurance. It just doesn't make any sense. And we need to basically have a massive Green New Deal style public works program that is targeted in communities of color that have been hardest hit and most exposed to the virus and to pollution, and sort of reignite opportunity for a whole new generation. Now is the time. It can both help create a public health core, a child care core. All of these things that we so desperately need right now to restart the economy are also things that help build and green our infrastructure.
Yeah, yeah. You've spoken about how the idea that we can contain pollution to so-called sacrifice zones is actually an illusion. Can you say what you mean by that?
Yeah, so in the course of doing the research for my book, it's called The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. I go through, 5, 6, 7 different areas of our society. And of course, I talk about the environment and climate as places where we haven't sufficiently tallied the costs of racism. And I talk to a whole bunch of experts. I go to frontline communities. And one of the things that became very clear to me was that by using our sort of typical age-old American zero-sum racist formula, right? The idea that if there's something bad in society, let's concentrate it with the people of color who don't have the economic and the political power to stop it. We have actually allowed more pollution, period, than we would have had we said, well, we don't want to pollute anybody's air. And so let's make the polluters control their pollution. And the research has borne that out. That places that have sacrifice zones where they're very segregated and where the political class has been able to say, let's site the hazardous waste there, let's site the incinerator there, there's more pollution for the white people who are in the safe area in those places than there are in more integrated places where there isn't a sacrifice zone to choose. And of course it makes sense, right? If you think you can dump it somewhere, why would you even try to control it? And so that's another way in which we have allowed there to be a sort of false sense of separation, a false sense that we can destroy, plunder, abuse, and extract people of color, and that it won't ultimately drain all that we hold in common and make our country poorer in so many ways. And I think right now what you're seeing across the country is environmental leaders, grassroots, and from the grassroots to the native groups to the big greens, recognizing that we need each other. And that part of why the cap and trade bill failed in the first years of the Obama administration was that we thought we could do it alone, right? The sort of professional class of environmental advocates thought, we could just get in there and, write the bill and do our lobbying and we'll pass this. We've got the Democrats. But it wasn't a big enough coalition. And another thing that I learned, Jane, that I was really shocked about was I dug into the data, the public opinion data on, who really cares about the climate and is sure that climate change is happening and wants us to take aggressive action. The majority of people of color, three out of four African Americans and Latinos, really, really want climate action. And it's about 50-50 with white folks.
Yeah.
And you would never think that if you look at, you sort of stereotype of the environmentalist is, white person. But, this is where I think that sort of the programming that white Americans have received for so long, that we're in it on our own, that we don't want big government because big government can't be trusted, which is an attitude that really grew after the civil rights movement. It was not the attitude before the civil rights movement, if you look back at the historical data. That ideology has made it so that white America and that ideology and the real sort of racial dog whistling from the right wing that said, Obama's coming after these coal jobs, Obama's trying to force the car companies to do something they don't want to do, has really made there be a pretty significant racial divide on climate action. And so we need a multiracial coalition to win on climate. And we need white people to organize other white people to be much more concerned about what's going to happen.
We need a multiracial coalition to do anything. Every time anybody's started to build one, it gets a whole lot of violent attention. I mean, that's when Martin Luther King was assassinated, when he began to build that multiracial coalition and
to deal with poverty. That's right.
That's right. Here's my last question before we take questions from the audience. You've said that there's an unprecedented level of interconnectedness in America at this moment, and that our politics could be transformed using that sense of solidarity as a way to turbocharge the demand for new policies. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. I because of exactly what you said, Jane, that when you have a multiracial coalition that really sees that their fates are linked, that really thinks, what happens to you happens to me. I am my brother and sister's keeper. That has been, frankly, what many people in communities of color have had to have that value, because we're treated as a collective, right? And we have had to lean on one another when the state has been neglectful or abusive over the course of American history up to today. And so that value, I think many, indigenous and communities of color and immigrant communities really live it every day, right? It is part of our social fabric. It's part of the way we have to function, and we do function. And that is a value that has been sort of systematically diminished, I think, as the message has been to white people, you can do it on your own. It's about you and how you succeed, and you don't need government, you don't need each other. And I think that the message of a global pandemic has absolutely sort of cracked that open. The pandemic has said, actually, we are only as safe as our neighbors are safe. And we are only as protected as our neighbors are protected. And that's why the same funders that are behind, same fossil fuel funders that are behind the organizing of the Tea Party, put money into fanning the flames of these, reopen protests, because it was clear that a moment of social solidarity was happening, where people were, doing things that they never thought they would do for their neighbors, where they were, sewing masks and planting gardens and volunteering and, getting going back into the medical profession when they had retired, and just asking, what can we do? That is a superpower, because all of the progressive goals that we want for making our economy more fair require that value at the core, right? They require a sense of interconnectedness at the core. And so that is why the right wing, that is why Donald Trump goes right at that sense of empathy, right? He doesn't want people who are struggling, who are Black, white, and brown, to see their struggles in one another. That would be too much power at the base. And so that's why he tries to demonize, degrade the humanity of people who are struggling, who are Black and brown, so that white people who are struggling do not empathize with them. And so that's our superpower. Sometimes we progressives, it takes us a while to figure out sort of, where our strengths are, like democracy and voting. And then we have to see where the right wing is attacking, and we realize, oh, that's where our strength is. And so I really do believe that the sense of empathy and solidarity is a superpower, is a strength. It will make you do things that you never thought you could do, because you're doing them for someone more than just yourself. You're doing them for something bigger than yourself. And you can do them with the trust that someone else would have your back and do it for you as well. That's a powerful way to walk through the world. And I think we're on the verge of having that as a society. And the question is, can we take this moment when Black people, who are the people who have held that spirit by hook or by crook, are being attacked. And I do believe in large degrees there's been a white supremacist call put out, and you start seeing much more white supremacist violence and activity online and offline. Are we going to, as a country, wrap our arms around the Black community and say enough is enough, and say we have your backs? Because right now, Black and brown people, our work, our labor is holding this country together. And we are, I think, going to overcome. I believe in my heart that we shall overcome. And I believe that there is going to be the country that is worthy of all of this work and this love that we have put into it for so long. But we can't do it alone.
I wish I could put my arms around you and give you a real
No.
hug, but I give you a virtual hug, Heather.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you. Do you mind if we open it up to questions?
Yes, please.
I'll ask our moderator, Sam. Sam, are there questions?
We've got questions. So Heather, we have a question. What role do you think the public school system plays in spreading racist and colonial history? And what role do you think they have in being part of the solution? This comes from Ash in Wyoming.
Great. I hope, Ash, if you're a teacher, thank you. It's a huge part. I did research on this for my book. If I'm not mistaken, it's certainly less than 20% of students, high school students, can correctly identify that slavery was the driving cause of the Civil War. I mean, that's crazy, right? That's crazy. There was a campaign, a very effective campaign, mainly carried by white women in the American South, called the Lost Cause, to sort of just change history, to replace the history of the treachery and the defeat with one that was morally upright. And part of why we have so many Confederate monuments that came in the 20th century all over the country, in places like Arizona, are because of that kind of ideology. And so I think that the public schools right now, which across the country are predominantly kids of color, mainly because white students have left the public school system, have gone to private schools, have really resegregated public schools, are absolutely a place where we can do re-education, but I think it can't stop at public schools because of that segregation. And I think it needs to happen in workforces. And frankly, my favorite vision that I have is that coming out of this depression that we are sliding into, we will have a major public service and public works program that is designed, to do the work that needs doing in this country, green first, but that also has as one of its core principles to put young people in integrated teams, kids from urban areas into rural areas and vice versa, and have us really experience working alongside one another in a multiracial democracy. And I think doing that for young adults and not just putting it in the classroom is really important.
Great. And then this one comes from Jasmine in Oakland. You mentioned color changes work around elected prosecutors. Can you speak more to the role of county and district attorneys and other public officials in the justice system? What can they do to change the culture of brutality in police departments across the country? And what can us as non-elected officials, just public citizens, do to also affect that?
That's a great question. Thank you. So let me just say that the website where you can find the prosecutor accountability work, who are district attorneys, it's another word for them, is called winningjustice.org. Winningjustice.org. You can look up who your prosecutor is, if there are any races, if the color of change has endorsed anyone. And then on there, you can also find an agenda that you can use to call and organize in those prosecutor races, and say, what is our police force use of force standard? Is there a civilian review board? Does it have teeth? When one of the most powerful places to organize is when the union contracts for police are up, and they're usually, renegotiated every set of years. That is where in those contracts, oftentimes, the state's hands are really tied in terms of keeping bad actors still on the force and just moving them around from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The man who's just gone into custody, who killed George Floyd, had a record of police violence and brutality, and should never have still been on the force, and should have been behind bars a long time ago. But oftentimes it's the collective bargaining agreements that the meatpacking workers don't have, but police officers have, and they are often some of the strongest. And even Democratic elected officials are sort of unwilling to take on the police union.
Sam, do you have another question?
Yeah, we have time for one last question from the audience. This one's from James in Colorado. Could you talk about the role you see Fox News playing in the diluting of our democracy? What should we know about this, and what can be done?
Oh, okay. Next hour, we'll be talking about Fox News and our democracy. I've said before, I don't really see how Fox News in its current iteration, its current profit formula, and a multiracial democracy can really coexist, right? When you have the most watched cable news network, as it often is, the most profitable cable news network, as it is, one of the most profitable entities in entertainment, being a hate for profit machine, as Elizabeth Warren coined, it is a major problem. There have been a ton of social science studies that have shown that by the hour, the more you watch Fox News, the more conservative you become. And we're not just talking about conservative in sort of the old-fashioned way of talking about. We're talking about it in terms of really receiving these messages of, fearing and hating the racial other, and feeling like white people are aggrieved, and believing conspiracy theories, and just having a whole separate reality base with which to view politics. And it's dangerous. It is, having state television, which is what Donald Trump has right now, is terrible for our democracy. It's terrible for, when you start to see those videos of everyday white folks, treating their Black and brown and Asian neighbors as if they're just dirt. You do wonder, what are they watching all day? What are the images that they are seeing all day, and what are the stories that they're hearing from the Sean Hannitys and the Tucker Carlsons of the world? So what can we do about it? I hate to say color of change again, but color of change is one of the most powerful corporate campaigning organizations, and they have taken on various parts of Fox News and won by doing doing corporate accountability around their advertisers. I also think that as part of the next the power shift that needs to and will happen in Washington, we need to get into a whole new system of regulating our media companies in the public interest, not what Trump just tried to do by executive order, but by bringing a sense of fairness to these new media platforms, including for-profit cable news. I think we need cultural campaigns that just say, talk to your uncle and your father and your grandparents and your cousins who are watching this, and make sure that they really realize what it is doing to the fabric of our country. When you think about going upstream, Fox News and right-wing radio are two of the most powerful sources of anti-climate, anti-government, and anti-Black and brown and anti-democracy messages that we have.
Yeah. Hey, Heather, do you mind? We've never run over. You are so interesting, and this is such a pivotal moment in our country right now. Do you mind if we run over with a few more?
I'm happy to.
Okay, thanks. Sam?
Great. All right. This one comes from Jill in Florida. You've spoken about the U.S. being a democracy in name only. Can you give a couple of examples of what you mean by this?
Is that my book editor asking that question? I am. So a couple things. Let's start from the founding, right? Because that's where we got the idea that we are a democracy. At the beginning, our founders created this amazing framework and made a constitutionally representative democracy, but left big holes in it in order to keep safe slavery. And so they skewed the representation system with the 3/5 clause. The Electoral College came from that, right? That's why we've had two unpopular presidents in just my lifetime who have been elected without the popular vote. And then importantly, at our founding, the franchise was limited just to white male men who owned property. And in many ways, that sort of original cramped view of whose voice mattered in our democracy, the fight and the history of our country has been the fight to expand that, right? From class blind suffrage to women's suffrage, to black men's suffrage, to women's suffrage, to the end of the poll tax, to the lowering of the voting age. It's been a march to actually perfect what was a hollow ideal at the beginning. And what we've seen over the past decade, as the Koch brothers and their like started to really organize around the rules of democracy, is that we've lost ground, right? The Shelby versus Holder case, which is sort of the twin to the Citizens United case. Both were brought and funded by the same Koch network billionaires. Basically said that the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which made Southern civic participation by African Americans go from 10% to 60% in the course of months and years in the South after the Voting Rights Act, basically gutted the Voting Rights Act, said that, as Justice Ginsburg said so eloquently, we take away the umbrella in the middle of a rainstorm because we weren't getting wet, right? We took away the exact protection that was making it so that there was a way to stop racial discrimination. And after Shelby versus Holder in 2013, we saw a rush of voter suppression laws that were really targeted at people of color and voters of color, often with surgical precision, right? What kind of IDs do people of color have and not, not white people have? But at the same time, it wasn't a completely precise. You had millions of white folks going to the polls and realizing they were purged, or that they couldn't get the notarized copy of their birth certificate that was required because they changed their name when they got married. I mean, we've been sending people through a Byzantine bureaucracy in order to shrink the electorate. And that is because, the people, this radical right-wing group of mostly millionaires and billionaires knows that their agenda is not popular. And so if they can't have they can't have their agenda with a well-functioning democracy. So a couple of resources I would recommend for people. There is a book by Nancy McLean called Democracy and Change. Jane Mayer's work on the Koch brothers. And this is where it's all connected to climate, right? If you look at sort of where this money is coming from, it's from fossil fuel billionaires to a large degree who don't want to see action on climate, don't want to see a responsive government. And so that's why there isn't, there's a democracy in name only, because we don't have 100% of eligible voters even registered, much less turning out. We have all of these ways in which the state works to choose the voters and not the other way around. But for the first time in my lifetime as an advocate, running when I ran Demos for a number of years and worked there for almost 20 years, and we focus on economic and political inequality. And so I was, on the front lines of many of these voting rights and campaign finance fights. For the first time in my lifetime as a democracy advocate, at least the Democratic Party is really quite united in the centrality of these issues. H.R. 1, the first bill that Nancy Pelosi led when she took back the gavel, was an omnibus democracy reform bill. And we can make huge changes. That's why they target the democracy rules, because they know that if you have public financing of campaigns and the lobbyists have less sway, they know that if you have automatic voter registration, then you have, an electorate that looks like America, and you have representatives that have to actually listen to their constituents instead of just discounting that poor and working class people won't be able to vote. So it's within our control, absolutely, to make this a real and functioning democracy and to keep that march of progress going forward.
I just want you to know that Nancy McLean was a guest on Fire Drill Fridays.
Ah, great, that's great. She speaks even more quickly than I do.
She does what?
She speaks even more quickly than I do.
You're just great. Can we take one more question, Sam?
Yeah, definitely. All right. This one comes from Linda on Zoom. I saw you last year when you got a call on C-SPAN from a man admitting his prejudice and asking how to change. That was such a powerful moment to witness. Can you talk about what that experience was like for you and how we at home can help embody the empathy you showed when trying to educate others?
That is so nice. Thank you. That was a number of years ago now. I was on C-SPAN on a live show. A man called in identifying himself as Gary from North Carolina, and he said, "I'm a white male and I'm prejudiced." And he went on to go into detail about his prejudice, particularly against Black people. But then he said, "But I want to change and become a better American." I reacted, as live television, I reacted by saying thank you for admitting your prejudice. And that really came out of that, what I talked about earlier in terms of recognizing that we've been in this era of colorblindness where we try not to, there's such a moral and social cost in some ways to admitting that you are prejudiced and that you have racism, which is as integrated into the air that we breathe as anything else. And so people don't admit it and then they don't work on it, right? So I thanked him, Gary, for doing that. Gary, that video was seen, millions of times and passed around, I think, because people wanted to believe that people can change. People wanted to believe they could admit it and not be, have their head bitten off. And Gary and I have since, gotten to know each other, and he's been on a walk at his home in North Carolina. He thinks about race a lot now and thinks about it differently. I think we have to, one of the ways that I can ground myself is to really remember that racist ideas have been sold for profit since the beginning of our society. And I'm more interested in holding accountable the people who are selling those ideas for profit than I am in those who are desperate enough to buy those ideas. And so when I think about a Gary, I think about who's talking to him, who's in his ear, who's explaining the world to him. It was, Fox News and Rush Limbaugh, Donald Trump. He was not being served by those racist ideas. In fact, it was causing him a great deal of social anxiety. And, in his words, he said, if I don't get right with this, I feel like it's going to kill me. And it caused him a moral weight. He didn't want to be in the camp of people who were taking guns into Black churches. He wanted to be on the right side of history. And so I think we do always have to keep the door open for that transformation. We can't both at the same time say that, you know, racism is real and pervasive and here, and not say that, therefore, it's going to take some work. It's going to take some effort. Not everybody, certainly not every person of color has the inclination or the time or the patience to do any of that kind of work. And I've made it very clear to Gary that this is his work to do, right? This is, I gave him some ideas about what he could do, but this is his walk and his journey. And it's not my responsibility. But at the same time, I do think that it is so clear where these messages, these anti-immigrant, these anti-Black messages come from. And it's so clear to me, at least, what the agenda is, right? To make sure that white people are still voting against their economic interests because of the perceived racial interest. That, I want to hold those people accountable, and I want to keep a door open to white people who are not actually getting as much from the racial bargain as they used to, and make that multiracial coalition. I do think it's possible. I think it's necessary, and I think it does take a little bit of grace. But I hope more white people will do it. We'll be the ones to talk to Gary. We'll be the ones to talk to the Garys in their lives, and also we'll be like Gary.
Heather, you're just the perfect person to have joined us today.
This is so good. Thank you, Jane.
So interesting. I'm so grateful to you. Thank you very much. I hope I get to meet you in person someday.
Absolutely. I'll see you in DC.
From you, I hope so. Thank you. Thank you. It's been just wonderful. And thanks to all of you who have joined us. If you haven't already, please text Jane to 877-877. As I said before, it's a quick way to find out what we're doing and to get alerts when there are opportunities for you to take action. And, we are building a people-powered movement to demand climate justice and justice of all kinds. We need your help. Please join me by signing up for one of our volunteer teams. We have hundreds of volunteers now all over the country doing very, very important work that's going to help us, especially between now and November. So please do sign up. And remember to call the Senate, the HEROES Act. It's sitting there. It's what people need in this country. It's what our essential workers need. It's what all of us need. So please call and pressure your senator to vote for it. You can find out everything you need to do that to firedrillfridays.com/workers. Next Friday on June 5th, it's the first Friday of the month, we're going to be back to our monthly Fire Drill Fridays virtual rally. And this one is going to be about ocean protection. So come hear from incredible speakers like Dr. Sylvia Earle, Dr. Ayanna Johnson, Niaz Dory, John Hosevar, and my good friend, Ted Danson. Thank you all so much for joining us. Stay safe and healthy out there. Take good care of each other. And remember, even if we're alone, we still have each other. See you next time.